Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, when Britain leaves the EU, one of the biggest challenges facing the government will be how to untangle more than 40 years' worth of entwined British and European law. What fun! Sorting it all into the desirable and the undesirable could take years, even decades. Well, some MPs have proposed speeding the process up by accepting all EU laws now before sorting through them all later on. Well, will it work? Our Ellie's been taking a look.
Ever wondered what 64,000 individual Acts of Parliament look like? Well, they're all here. Pretty much all of the UK's laws written down on sheep or goat skin and stored here in the archive in Parliament. The biggest scrolls, I'm told, relate to issues of taxation. The smallest are divorces.
Aha, this is arguably the most important thing in here, the European Communities Act of 1972. Essentially, it enshrines a principle that British law had to comply with European law. It's like this is the boss of everything else in here.
Of course, all that's about to change. Brexit means British law will once again be supreme. There's just the little issue of working out how.
Essentially, it's quite simple. When you leave the European Union, you repeal the European Communities Act, but you also bring all the European law into your own law. So it is British law, and then you can change it after you've left if you want to, or keep it the same if you want to. You don't have to change anything as you're leaving.
There are two types of EU law: regulations, which apply automatically in all member states, and EU directives, which set out aims that parliaments must then legislate for. Acts of Parliament, like these, and statutory instruments, which flesh out how they work. Complicated? Yeah, and that's why this constitutional expert says it's a job that could take up to a decade to sort out. The law, after all, is constantly evolving and tested through the courts.
You can't simply cut and paste without an awful lot of care. And one example of what happened when the Supreme Court was created is, I think the government thought, Tony Blair thought, tremendously easy, we'll just repeal the office of Lord Chancellor. Well, we now have a Lord Chancellor. Why? Because he couldn't repeal it. When you look through the thousands of Acts of Parliament with references to the Lord Chancellor, he couldn't get rid of it. And there'll be an awful lot of that kind of difficulty when you try to get rid of some EU law.
Because of the way laws are implemented, it's really hard to nail down the scale of just how far EU law is entrenched in British law. During the referendum campaign, estimates varied from 60% to 13%. And there's no doubt we'd like to keep some of them.
Over the years, we've come to accept a lot of the EU employment rights, equality laws, and things like that. We don't want to get equal pay for men and women, non-discrimination. We want to keep all that. But some of the more ridiculous regulations in agriculture, for example, or in regulating competition, for example, we may want to get rid of.
No one seems to be disputing that this legal separation can be done, just how long it might take. But whatever happens, as soon as Britain leaves, the Communities Act will be effectively ripped up. And no, of course, that's not the real one.
Yes, there was a slight gasp here in the studio. We're joined now by the UKIP MP Douglas Carswell. Welcome to the Daily Politics. So clear this up for us. What proportion of EU law is statute, i.e. made by Parliament, and what proportion is common law?
About 60% of law made last year originated from the EU. There's a huge amount of regulation, statute and law that emanates and was created under the auspices of the European Communities Act. When we leave, we would vote to make all of that law, all of that regulation, British law. It could subsequently be amended or not amended, but the actual act of converting it into British law and leaving is relatively straightforward.
Well, you say that, except we've just heard the exact opposite, that it isn't straightforward, that you can't just take everything that was EU law or originated in EU Parliament and put it into British law, because you can't... Well, I'm only taking from him, but you can't cut and paste. You can't just say, EU law, I'll rub that bit out and I'll just write British court.
With great respect, when Britain and other countries decolonised in the 40s, 50s and 60s, the pattern was that law that had been supposedly imposed by Britain on those countries then became domestic law of those countries until subsequently amended. It's relatively straightforward. The process of then changing will be unending because in a self-governing democracy, every new government may want to modify and change the law. But the actual process of making every piece of legislation brought in under the auspices of the European Communities Act, British law, is relatively straightforward.
Right. Exactly how many laws will we need to repatriate then?
Well, the entire body of legislation brought in under the European Communities Act 1972 will become British law.
How many laws are they, roundabout? Numbers are we talking about? Hundreds? Thousands?
Tens of thousands. And since we joined the European Communities Act, there has been an exponential growth in so-called secondary legislation.
Yeah.
Because the European Communities Act allows technocrats to create law without our consent, there has been a blizzard of legal regulation.
Does it sound simple to you?
No, I mean, it's not at all. And it's something that I think was warned about before the vote on the 23rd of June, that this would take an inordinate amount of time. I think there are some people who think it's just going to be you repeal the European Communities Act 1972 and that's it. It's going to take a lot longer than that. But the other two other points. One is obviously the regulations, which have direct effect. So we've got to make a decision. That's not law as such. We've got to make a decision about which ones of those we want or don't want. The other thing, and this is quite a legal techie point, is actually the rulings of the European Court of Justice in terms of precedent, because lawyers in court will often argue about precedent and they'll look at what was meant when a statute or a regulation or a directive was introduced. That's still going to apply for some years to come until we build up our own.
Of course, it would
body.
be British courts after we've left adjudicating. People would have the same rights, but it would be British courts.
Well, would they, though? I mean, the lawyer here was actually saying that if you get rid of a certain number of laws, the ones Bernard Jenkins were talking about, he wants to keep them, but employment and workers' rights, and it takes time to incorporate them or rewrite them into British law, those workers won't be protected.
On the contrary, I think I tried to say this at the beginning. All existing laws and rights would remain and be brought in as British law.
Right, except he says you can't do that as simply as cutting and pasting.
If I may say, there are about 200 countries around the world, and almost all of them are self-governing. Self-government is not such a ridiculously complicated process that we can't manage it. We can manage it, and we can manage it in a fairly straightforward way.
And the lawyer said you could manage it, but he didn't think it was straightforward. So you think he's wrong?
It's generous of him to concede that self-government is possible.
Well, it's that transition, isn't it, that's going to take an awfully long time. And the amount of government time, civil service time, parliamentary time in terms of scrutinising.
Parliament making public policy? Now there's a thought.
Well, but you're right. But I mean, it's a question of Parliament actually is going to. I mean, it's going to keep us busy.
I think a good democratic principle would be that until there's a general election where parties publish manifestos specifying what it is they want to change, the default should be not to change. I think, by all means, Jeremy Corbyn can promise to nationalise the railways, currently illegal while we're in the EU. If he wants to do that, not something I'd advise, but we shouldn't change these laws until we've had an election and people have got a mandate in their manifestos to change existing rules and laws.
So do you accept that it will tie up the UK Parliament for years, possibly a decade?
Self-government is quite a busy process.
Right.
We've been doing it for several centuries, and it takes up the time of ministers and politicians.
You've always liked smaller government, fewer ministers, less time being spent on these things. But now you're advocating we should do the exact opposite.
On the contrary, being in the EU means that we've had an explosion in the number of statutory instruments and regulations and rules. If Parliament has to take responsibility for lawmaking, I think we would get fewer laws but better framed, and the
After about 10 years.
and the people that they are those laws most impact would have recourse to change them if they didn't like it.
Right, so you do think Parliament will be best served recreating 40 years' worth of EU laws, however long it takes?
As I've tried to explain, Joe, we're not needing to recreate things because all existing laws will be transposed and become UK law.
You will have to recreate some of them that have originated from the EU. You will have to recreate and then decide which ones you want to get rid of.
Things like regulations, and don't forget also that some of our businesses, people who are obviously going to carry on working with, trading with EU member states, whatever those arrangements are going to be, they benefit from those mutual regulations. If we want to carry on with those relationships, then we've also got to think it's not just about us sometimes, it's about other countries.
Mutual standard recognition is a slightly different issue, but it's perfectly compatible with leaving the EU. I would say that actually by being outside the EU it would be easier to have trade relationships based on mutual standard recognition than we do in the single market, which imposes a single uniform standard on everyone.
Right.
Things like passporting and financial services firms. So
I think equivalence makes passporting in the city largely redundant. Equivalence means that you don't actually need the kind of passporting treaty arrangements that Switzerland, for example, has with the EU. It's perfectly possible. I mean, Nikki, if you want to refight the referendum campaign, you're making these arguments 6 months too late.
I think what the realisation now is that actually this is going to be incredibly complicated. It's going to take a lot of civil service, time and cost. And of course, it's not just Parliament. It affects businesses, people out in the country, it affects public services, the NHS and local
self-government does take up the time of politicians.
And it's what people want. And it's what people wanted. They wanted to take back control of laws. They wanted to do what Douglas Carswell is suggesting. So in a way, Parliament has to do this.
I think they did want to take back control, but I think people didn't necessarily. I've had emails from people saying actually it's just as simple as repealing the European Communities Act. That's literally just the starting point. Even that's not going to happen until we finish the Article 50 negotiations.
Maybe your party and my party could publish a manifesto with chapters saying what it is we intend to change. I personally would like higher environmental standards. I would like to ban live animal exports to the EU. We can now do those things, and we don't need to blame Brussels for not being able to deliver for our constituents anymore. It's going to be good for democracy.
You've thought an awful lot about this, just before we let it go, obviously, over the years. What role do you see yourself playing in the Brexit negotiations over the next few years?
I hope I play a very constructive role. I think David Davis and Liam Fox are off to an absolutely flying start. There's a new committee being created in the House of Commons to shadow the Brexit department. I would love to be part of that and play a constructive role in making sure that we leave the EU, but we continue to cooperate with our European friends and neighbours as needed.
At this point, wouldn't you rather be on the government benches being part of this?
The government? Good heavens, no. I've never been comfortable with being part of the government ever.
Just thought I'd check. Thanks. Let's stay with the subject of Britain's exit from the European Union now, because yesterday the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, appeared in front of a Lords committee and made a number of interesting comments, including claiming that his was the sexiest brief in government.
There's been a bit of criticism of the government that we haven't said much yet. Well, it's going to take some months to analyse many of the industrial effects of various options and commercial effects. It's going to take some months to do the analysis on the negotiating balance, where our allies might be and where they might not be. This is likely to be the most complicated negotiation of modern times. It may be the most complicated negotiation of all time. But even with, and you mentioned this in your report as well, with private hearings, I have to caution you that I may not be able to tell you everything, even in private hearings, because this is really the sexiest area of politics at the moment. Everybody writes to us and we get vast income. And my department at the moment is actually quite tiny.
Yes, I know that.
I mean, it has quadrupled in 1 month, basically 1 month. It's 8 weeks, but everybody around this table knows what Whitehall and Brussels are like in August.
Well, Mr Davis is a busy man and will continue to be so, because this afternoon he's also due to appear in front of MPs on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Nadeem Zahawi will be one of those putting the questions to him, and he joins us now. So, is this the sexiest place to be in Whitehall, in the exiting the EU department?
Well, I certainly think it's probably the most exciting place to be if you are in Whitehall, in terms of being able to work out what our position is going to be, so that when we do trigger Article 50 in 2017, we're able to effectively, once we know what that position is, articulate it and negotiate a settlement that works for the United Kingdom. As Theresa May has said, she wants it to work for business, so business have the opportunity to continue to trade and export with Europe, as well as taking control of our borders.
What are you going to ask him?
Well, I don't want to preempt my select committee. My colleagues will be very upset if I sit here and tell you what the questions are going to be.
So you have got them all written down ready?
We've got many questions written down. Some are not necessarily written down, but will come through the interrogation, or the ability to inquire of our new Secretary of State. But of course, we want to look at the structure of his department. We want to look at how he intends to report back to Parliament. He quite rightly said, look, what we can't do is give a running commentary. Theresa May repeated that in the chamber at PMQs. I think it would be wrong of the government to give a running commentary as to what their thinking is and what the position papers that will come through. But once those position papers have become more solid, he'd obviously have to have scrutiny of a select committee.
It sounds fascinating, this thing this afternoon.
It is.
Is it? He's not going to tell you anything, is he?
Well, no, I disagree.
He's just said, I'm not going to... He said in this committee hearing there in the House of Lords, he said, I'm afraid we're going to have to keep quite a lot of the negotiations secret.
Sure.
We're not going to brief parliamentarians. The running commentary that you've talked about, which is a great shame, of course, for us as political broadcasters and commentators. So you're not going to learn anything.
I disagree. Our job is to scrutinise. Our job is to push government. That's what select committees do. That's why actually they've worked so well, because now we have chairmen that are elected by the whole House, therefore have the accountability to the whole House, and we will look at things like the structure of the department, budgets, the direction of travel. Of course, we can't. You've got to be realistic here. We can't have the detail of a negotiation before the government's had that negotiation. But once they've had that negotiation, we want to make sure that there are commitments that they will come and, in the spirit of transparency and scrutiny, be able to come before our committee or other committees and deliver that to the House.
Do you have some sympathy with David Davis being asked questions that he can't answer?
Well, I think we've all been through it as ministers, but I think it's one of those. I think we're all finding our way, because he's right to say this is going to be the most complex set of negotiations. We just had how complex the legal changes are going to be.
Not according to Douglas Carswell.
Well, but I think they will be. It's obviously very, very complex. I have to say, David Davis did say last week in the statement that he would keep Parliament informed and engaged, everything else. There is a balance we struck between no running commentary and nothing at all. And I think we are, 2 months after the vote. We do need a plan now as to when we're going to start the negotiations. And I'd quite like to know where the government would like to end up. I mean, things like free movement, access or single market or whatever it might be. It's really important, I think, because otherwise other people will put in their penneth-in, and this is for the government. So whether it's this afternoon or whether in the course of between now and the end of the parliamentary term, I think we need a lot more detail in Parliament on this.
Well, I think the principle, the guiding principle, is what the Prime Minister set out. Theresa May said what she will want is a deal that works for British business to export, to trade freely with Europe, and controlling our borders.
Is that going to be the priority?
Well, that must
I thought it was the borders that were going to be the priority.
She is the boss. She is the Prime Minister. Before you interrupted me, what I was saying is free trade for our businesses across Europe and controlling our borders. That were her guiding principles. So I think you've got to take the guide from the DNA of any organisation comes from the top, and it comes from Theresa May. Right.
I mean, reaching a settlement was still possible, said David Davis, within the 2-year time frame set out under Article 50, but will be very difficult. Do you think that's just going to slip?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, our job on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee is to question the government as to what their targets are, what the structures they're putting in place, the resource they have available to them to meet those targets. You've got to take them at their word that that's the target. That's what he set out. It is possible to deliver that, and we've got to take that at face value. But what we do is to kick the tyres to make sure that that target is realistic and can be met.
Right, we'll be watching it all later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been getting